Hi, Becca C. Smith here, and I have been planning this series for almost a year now. So finally, I am able to share this with you guys. If you have read my books, you know I am obsessed with immortality. But more than that, the older I get, the more I realize it's about what we leave behind. And to me, there is nothing greater than a good story. This series will be about discovering writers that are rarely talked about anymore, and I am going to focus mainly on female sci-fi, fantasy, paranormal authors. Because A, I am one, and B, let's face it, most of history is told through the lens of men, and I personally wanted to learn about women that I've never heard of before. Not to say that they weren't famous or well-known or well-respected in their own right during their own time, but because of all the craziness of society and information and content constantly being thrown at us, their names and work have been buried in time. I want their stories to be heard again, to be remembered, and to know that somewhere in the ether, they will never be forgotten. The first thing I did is I went to a website called the Encyclopedia for Science Fiction. And you're able to look up all sci-fi, fantasy, paranormal, horror authors on this search engine. It's awesome. You can actually search by decades. My tedious task is to go through the entire list and just look for women names. Now, some people use initials, so I would have to go in to the actual biography of the person to see if that person was a woman or a man, but mostly I was just able to go through and find female names. And I would do this in 200-year chunks. I started at 1600 and then I stopped at 1950. And I did that because, let's face it, women are killing it in the teen paranormal, sci-fi, horror genre today. But back then, shocker, out of almost 7,000 authors in the sci-fi horror genre, only 197 of them were women. And I got to admit, that's pretty painful. That is such a tiny percentage. And you know there were a ton of other female writers out there that have written fantasy, fiction, sci-fi, horror, all of those things, but weren't allowed to publish because they were female. I went through the list, and the first name that caught my eye, and you'll see why, the author is labeled as Two Women of the West. I was like, first of all, I'm obsessed with Westerns, so I didn't even know if it was Westerns, but just for these two women to call themselves that, they didn't go by their actual names. They were just like, we are the Two Women of the West. Come on. It's cool. This is what I decided. So I clicked on them. The Two Women of the West are Alice Ilgen Fritz Jones and Ella Robinson Merchant. And the book that they wrote is called Unveiling a Parallel, a Romance. And it was published in 1893. 127 years ago. So I wanted to research the authors and see what I could find out about them. Honestly, I wasn't able to find much on the internet. There really wasn't that much about these authors. I could find some of the book because they did re-release it in '92, so I saw it on Kindle. I was like, okay, maybe I'll get the Kindle because the hard copy, I think, was a lot because it's out of print at this point. And there's a publishing company called Good Press where they did a little blurb on the Kindle version saying that they like to take obscure and unheard of books and get them out on Kindle so people could read them. That is a noble undertaking. I think that's amazing. The internet search came up with, birth dates, basic information. Not much on their personal life, but I went on a website called findagrave.com. This is actually a really useful site. And I didn't find much more information, but I did find out that a woman by the name of Carol A. Colmerton wrote an intro to Unveiling a Parallel when they re-released it in 1992. So I wanted to read the Kindle, but the Kindle doesn't have the introduction, and I need this introduction. I looked it up on LosAngelesLibrary.com. I don't know the actual website, and I found there are 2 copies in all of Los Angeles. They're both at the Downtown Library, which is one of my favorite libraries on the planet. So cross your fingers, and that's where I'm going next.
Anything else that you need?
No, just that book.
Just this will give the rest of it. Okay, why don't you have a seat?
Okay.
And check back with us in about 3 to 5 minutes.
Okay, great. I think they have to go to the back to get it because there's only 1 copy.
You're welcome. Yeah, it was unusually shelved, but they found it under T's.
Oh.
Cataloging for whatever reason.
No, I get it. I know, but that's what they called themselves, the 2 Women of the West. So, I mean, it makes sense, but it's funny. Success! We found the introduction, and it's almost as long as the book. So we're going to get lots of good info. Check this out while we're waiting for our food. Oh my gosh. Okay, Unveiling a Parallel was released for $1.50.
Wonderful spicy.
The following year it came out in a 2nd edition and then quickly went out of print. Oh, that's so sad. As you saw, I got it! Okay, so I'm back. I have already read the introduction, and even reading the beginning of the introduction, finding out that Carol Colmerton had such a difficult time finding anything on these 2 women as well. She had to go through so much to find anything that she could on these women. Let me just give you a brief history of these 2 amazing women. These 2 Women of the West. Still love that name. The book was published at Arena Publishing Company. Alice and Ella sent the book to them and they decided to publish it. But this publishing company was also what was called a vanity publishing company, which means that you could pay to have someone publish your book. I guess it was the earliest forms of self-publishing. This wasn't self-published, but this company did that. They were known for publishing books about social reform. So it makes sense that they would publish a book, even just from the description that I've read of this book, since I haven't read it yet, about feminism and things like that. 1 year after its release, they did a 2nd printing because it didn't do that well, and it also didn't do that well, and so they stopped printing it. This book, after a year, was toast, which is so sad. We talk about feminism. Maybe it was too much at the time. I don't know. They didn't get any mainstream reviews because it was by this publishing house that was also kind of considered a self-publishing house. And you know, thinking 127 years later, these are some of the same struggles self-publishers have, is trying to get legit reviews because they're self-published. Obviously, this has been a problem for a long time. They weren't even self-published, but because they were publishing under a company that had self-published books, they don't get the big reviews. The reviews they did have were mixed. Some people got it, some people didn't. Basically, 100 years go by and the only people that really know about Alice and Ella are utopian experts, so they decided to re-release it in 1992. In the intro, Colmerton even says about Alice and Ella, "These women have remained lost writers, their book doomed to an unjustified obscurity." I mean, it's kind of like the whole point of doing this video is just to put light on people that have written these books and are just not recognized anymore and really weren't recognized back then. Luckily, since from the intro and everything that I'm reading, they do talk about suffrage, but in like a fantasy landing on Mars kind of way. It's very important Like, this book is very important. I'm glad that other people feel this way enough to put it on Kindle, enough to re-release it in 1992. If I can put any more light on this book, I will feel like I did something. Ella was from Iowa. Her parents were from New York. She got married to Lorenzo Merchant, who owned newspapers. He died in 1894, which was when the second reprint came out of Unveiling a Parallel. And then she took over as president of his printing company. And she died in 1916 in Nebraska with no kids. She never had any kids. Alice was 11 years older than Ella. She was born in Ohio and lived mainly in Cedar Rapids. Her father was a furniture dealer and mayor of Clarksville. Alice wrote her first book under a pen name, Ferris Jerome. It was called High Watermark, and it was published by J.B. Lippincott Company in 1879. It was a romance where the lead protagonist dies. But in 1880, she rewrote it and called it Westbrook, and the main character gets married instead of dies. Interesting. Does she see marriage as death now? I don't know. Anyway, it was to appeal to women and actually sell more copies. Now, Alice got married for the first time at the age of 38. So you can imagine in that time period, she was an old maid in those terms. 38, and he was also a furniture salesman like her father. He had a daughter named Isabel, and so she was a stepmom, and that was her only child. And that was in 1884. So she didn't write from 1884 until Unveiling a Parallel came out in 1893. So it was a big chunk of time that she didn't write. So I guess she was probably at the time period being a mother and wife and stopped writing. So she got back into it, and maybe, haven't read it yet, but maybe we can read some frustrations. Some frustrations might be coming out in this book. We'll see. But after Unveiling a Parallel, she did publish 3 more books after that. So obviously this got her back into writing mode, and she published 3 more books. And 2 of her books, The Beatrice of Bayeux and The Chevalier de Saint Denis, were both critically acclaimed as well. So she kicked some butt. But then she died on vacation in Cuba in 1906 of a cerebral hemorrhage. Horrible. And that's it on the 2 women. So out of the 30-page intro, that's all we got on these women. But it does give me an idea of who they were. I think it's time. I think it's time that I finally read Unveiling a Parallel, a romance. My initial thoughts of this book, man, is it interesting and fascinating. This book is basically about a man that lands on Mars. It's Earth. I mean, down to plumbing, time. They all refer to time as the same as it's midnight. It's whatever, the horse and carriage, roads, houses, everything. Everything is the same. Parallel, unveiling a parallel. The whole book is the main character comparing Earth to Mars, especially in regards to women, because on Mars, women and men are completely equal. And so he is shocked and appalled by it. The other thing that shocks and appalls him, hence why it's called a romance, is Elodia, who is the sister of Severnius, who is the main guy that shows him around. Now, I would love to tell you the name of the main character, but they did not give him a name. And it's interesting. So I think they did that for a reason. I think they did that to represent all men of that age. This guy represented all men of that age. And there are times where you hoped he would get it, but ultimately, I gotta say, by the end, he really didn't. He didn't get it. He still saw things the way he saw things. He still saw men and women as unequal. This was their fantasy. Their fantasy was just being able to vote. Their fantasy was being able to drink alcohol in public. I didn't even know that was a thing, by the way. Their fantasy was just to live normal lives, be in politics, be doctors, be anything they wanted to be and it didn't matter if they were women. And that was not reality when they wrote this book. The title, Unveiling a Parallel, a Romance, was it a romance? No, I don't know why, but I feel like there's a lot of books back then that they categorized as a romance, and it just wasn't. And I don't know if that's because it might have been easier to publish as a romance coming from female authors. You know, that's a gray area I'm not sure about. Because honestly, Elodia, she's a Marsian, not a Martian, but a Marsian, that's what they called them. She was just not into him, and he did not get it. Women wrote this. It's very obvious to anyone else reading the book that she's not that into him, but he just doesn't see it. He's in denial. And it's interesting for me because when you're reading it, the main character is male, so you just automatically think, dude, hello, get over, like, oh my. He's very delusional, this guy. I'm breaking down this book because there are some things in this book that were fascinating to me, just in how both of these women expressed the main character's opinions, which ultimately was the opinions of men of that day, or how they saw it. The main character arrives in Mars in an aeroplane. Now, this is before airplanes were invented, so it's kind of cool. So I know there was a lot of sci-fi going on where they were traveling to Mars and places like that. This was one of those. 3/4 of the book that he's with Elodia and Severnius. One of my favorite quotes from the book is when he's looking up at the sky for the first time as he's going to bed, and it says, "Every star stood out, not a mere twinkling eye or little flat silver disk, but a magnificent sphere, effulgent and supremely glorious." I can only imagine how amazing that would be. Just look up and you just see planets and moons. This is probably not the view of Mars, but it's a really pretty picture that I loved. He's very shocked at the way that Elodia and Severnius talk to each other because he is not used to women talking to men as a man would talk to a man on Earth, essentially. And one of the quotes is, "There was none of that condescension in his manner that there often is in our manner towards women of our households. They were on a level with each other, the highest level of both, for they held each other up to their best." That seems to be what I think the authors would want the ideal to be, that hi, we're just human beings. We should be able to talk to each other equally. Just because you're a man and I'm a woman shouldn't make a difference. And so when he sees this, he's like, what? Women should be demure. Their portrayal of the main character, he who must not be named, and Severnius, the Marsian who takes him around and is essentially the male counterpart on Mars. And Severnius, of course, is shocked at how they treat women on Earth. And so you really love Severnius. He's not supposed to be the main character, but you love him. So a part of me still isn't sure what their intent with this book was. And since it wasn't successful, it's more of an interesting look into history and how women were feeling at that time. Because one of the quotes, when Severnius is very shocked that women would even put up with not being able to vote or any of these kinds of things. He says, "And do your women submit to such conditions? Do they not try to alter them, throw them off?" "Oh, they submit, of course," I said. "I never heard of a revolt or an insurrection among them, though there seems to be growing up among them lately." Now, this was the time where the suffrage was taken up a notch. This was where it became a fight, where it was public. It was happening. This is where it was happening. Suffrage had been going on for a long time, but women had had enough. And so this book kind of helped fight the fight at the time, or I think that's what they were hoping. I think they were hoping that if men read this, they would go, "Oh yes, look at all these hypocrisies. I see them now." I don't think that happened. And this is where he who must not be named confronts Severnius when he finds out that women on Mars can vote. "Excuse me," I said, "but do I understand to say that your women have the right to suffrage?" "Assuredly. Do not yours?" "Indeed, no," I replied, the masculine instinct of superiority swelling within me. I feel like they really hate their main character. I feel like they wrote a character that represented all men that lived, and some men today live in that bubble of women and men are not equal. And then Severnius, after having this whole debate about voting, The main character asks Severnius, "Tell me, Severnius, when did your women wake up?" Severnius smiled. "My dear sir, I think they have never been asleep." Ah, that's so good. Severnius has to come in and go, "What do you mean? Why aren't they allowed to do these things?" So he's sort of the voice of reason for the two authors, I think, to just be like, why? And pointing out all the parallels and pointing out all the hypocrisies. That is Severnius's role. Elodia, they have this long talk and they're getting to know each other, and he finds out that she has an illegitimate child out of wedlock, and that's it. That's the end of the romance. That's like the final straw for he who must not be named. Her moral fiber, as he puts it, is just so out of whack that he could never be with somebody like that. Ever. It's gross. It's like, dude, it was never even a possibility. She never liked you. Ever. I highly recommend reading this book, if even just for the history's sake of it. And you can get it on Kindle, which is so nice. You don't have to go through the struggle I did to find the hard copy of the only one in Los Angeles. I would imagine it would be more difficult in smaller cities to find. So you can download it. I think it's like 99 cents on your Kindle. You don't get the cool intro, but you get to read the book. And this was just my first episode, but it has made me so hungry to read more. And the craziest thing about reading this book was that it felt like I was reading something today about something that was written over 100 years ago. I had to keep reminding myself that this was written 127 years ago. And they wrote the misogynistic male so well that I'd also have to remind myself that two women wrote this. They captured that type of guy perfectly, which means they probably had a lot of exposure to guys like that. And I've had a lot of exposure to guys like the main character of Unveiling a Parallel as well. But luckily, I've also met a lot of men like Severnius, which may not have been in abundance back when they wrote this book. He may have been their ideal, not their practical. Is today perfect? No. Is it eons better than back then? Yes. And it's weird because at first, hearing that this book was categorized, after I read it, categorized as a utopia, I was like, okay, the last couple chapters are definitely utopian because, you know, everybody loves each other, everybody works together, everybody's equal, this and stuff. But I'm like, the first 3/4 are not a utopian. I mean, you've got all the same vices and bad societal decisions, like booze and greed and sex and drugs and all these things. Those were the parallel. They were exactly like Earth. So I'm like, how can this be a utopia? But then I realized this was 127 years ago. So just the simple fact of men and women being completely equal, that was the utopia for them. And admittedly, that would be a utopia for women today as well. And that realization hit me really hard. Even though we know so little about Alice Jones and Ella Merchant, I love that we can get to know them a little bit better through their writing, because I know when I write, I put a lot of myself into my books, into my screenplays, into anything that I write. It's part of the process. And yes, it's fiction, yes, it's fantasy, but it's still me. And I just wonder what they would think of the world today. Okay, I'm only one episode in and I'm completely jumped down the rabbit hole. I am excited. So I have my list. I've already gone through the 197 women and I've picked out the 8 that I'm going to focus on. I hope you guys join me for this journey and I hope you enjoyed learning about this book and these women as much as I did. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you in the next one. See you then.